Lumetri Scopes to read and understand all type of the visual data within a footage. The whole process of getting a little bit more accurate type of natural looking tones, keeping that bit more visual consistency within a footage, because our eyes and our screen sometimes can be lying to us a little bit. We think it looks right, but looking at the actual charts and the visual data, it's not always the way we actually think it looks like. So just to maintain that consistency and correctness, either just add the Lumetri Scopes panel directly here, or perhaps preferably you might also go directly into the workspace of color for just getting a good setup. I've added 2 videos, and as you can see, these already look really great. But let's use the Lumetri Scopes to be able to see the data and all the visual values behind the footage and see why it is that they actually look great now. And just to be able to understand the Lumetri Scopes overall and how you can use it and apply it to your own footage. Right now, we're looking at the 4 different type of main scopes within the Lumetri Scopes, and as a type of diagnostic tool to read and understand the footage, the visual data behind it. The one up to the left is called a Vectorscope. To the right of that, we got a histogram. Down to the very left, a parade. And to the right, we got a waveform. Let us just go over them one by one and ticking off each 4 of them. Starting with the Vectorscope YUV, where the Y stands for the luminance brightness and the UV stands for chrominance, as in hue and saturation. Only showing the latter though here, the hue and saturation. Then to change the view, you can either just right click directly on the scopes or go down to the toolbar and on this adjustable wrench icon. Just tick any of the 4 scopes at the top to view or hide them. You might also want to go directly into the preset and choose any of the view forms here, or you might also want to create a custom one, a little bit depending on what we just marked to be able to view outside. Viewing this in either the 8-bit, in the float, or HDR, as in high dynamic range, making it possible to just be able to view a little bit more details in those very dark or those very bright areas within a footage. I will be using the float to represent the project's 32 bpc float, as in giving the most accurate and precise type of color readings for the visual data. So let's choose the Vectorscope first, and to be able to adjust this footage, I will create a new adjustment layer, and let's name this one Lumetri Color. Heading over to Effects and Presets to search for it, and just double click it, or you might want to drag and drop it directly over the layer. You might want to use different type of adjustment layer on each different layer that you are color correcting and color grading, or you might also want to use one adjustment layer for each level or step of color correction or color grading. Perhaps you just whack everything on one and do it all on just one. It's a little bit depending on your preferences and needs, what suits your workflows the best, if you will. But for the actual sake of simplicity, using the Lumetri Scopes within this video and this footage, I will be using just one adjustment layer on this pre-corrected and graded footage. What the Vectorscope is actually showing us is the very amount of color in the hue and saturation for the footage. The line or circle furthest out indicates the very maximum of saturation. Colors reaching the ring are very intense, while the inner line is normally a quite good indication of a good amount of saturation. And it has been a rule of thumb to not crossing this line whenever we are doing at least color correction. In the center, the middle point indicates no saturation or color. So let's watch the effect of this, just dragging up the saturation to the very maximum, where the cyan, as a mix of blue and green, is getting very far to the outer extreme line, and just crossing the yellow inner line, as in the blend of green and red. We then got the other color marker to be found in the top right of this scope, is the magneta, and it's a red and blue cocktail of color. Now let us drag down the saturation fully and watching how both the colors and saturation disappear and creating this black and white look. Overall, the Vectorscope tells us that this footage is just below the recommended maximum saturation for color correction, while tilting mostly against the yellow and cyan colors. This makes sense since there's a large amount of this very light blue cyan color in this water area and the sky with some yellow and green over it at the right side of the landscape. Another way to use the Vectorscope is with this line here from the middle up against the outer circle between the yellow and red, and slightly tilted against the latter, I guess. So if I were to add this footage of a woman in the skate park, I may be using this line that we can see here to my advantage, also known as the skin tone line or the skin tone indicator, and it's just a bit of a standard reference or guiding line to get a little bit more accurate type of natural looking skin tone within the footage. And I find this the very easiest to just create a mask around the talent's cheek or perhaps forehead as well, a little bit depending on the situation. And reflected in the actual scope, the skin tones, as we can see, are well balanced along this specific line. If it's not, we could, for example, directly influence the tint, meaning drag it a little bit more to the negative against the green going left. Or we can go to the positive against the magenta going right, getting it spot on the line. There's also other ways to impact this a little bit, as the temperature connected to a camera's white balance. So anytime you're lowering the values, you are making the whole footage a bit cooler, a little bit more against the blue colors. Anytime you are raising it a bit, you also make the footage a little bit warmer, more against the orange colors. We might also play around with the different curves and color wheels, which will be included in the Lumetri color effect. For the skin tone saturation, it might be quite a good indicator for this specific skin tone and a bit lighter ones in general to reference the saturation just about before, somewhere around there, the half mark on this line, while moving it a bit closer against the center, the darker the skin tone of a talent. Sometimes it's just really valuable to properly track or mask the whole footage, as perhaps whenever you're doing color correction or grading that's different from the talent's face and the actual background that you want to separate. To just quickly show a bit of difference between our two mountain footage, the first one has just a little bit more blue tones in it overall, and while changing to the mountain's green layer, seeing this, the scope is tilting a little bit more against the yellow and green ones instead. Perhaps you've seen this one before, either like this raw histogram, or turn to the actual horizontal instead, perhaps a bit more basic version in your camera to get a quick look at the exposure and contrast. The blacks or the shadows at the bottom, and the whites or the highlights at the top. And then we got all the gray and mid-tones in the middle here between. To add a little bit simplicity to this view, I will just switch over to the 8-bit mode, where the very darkest is represented by 0 for all the 3 RGB channels, while the very brightest ones in the top are at 255. Whenever examining the histogram, we see that the leftward peaks indicate that there are more pixels at certain type of brightness levels or tones, while the rightward valleys show fewer pixels at those brightness levels. We see red, green, and blue colors separately, the RGB, while the gray areas indicate where all three colors combine, while yellow, cyan, and magnet appear where two of the colors mix together. The histogram just gives us a really good and quick indication of if a footage has been digitally modified or processed, any type of changes has been made to it. And this can be seen if there is a little bit more uneven type of color distribution, or you might see some sharp clipped areas or regions in it. Dragging up the whites in the Lumetri color, a lot of those areas already white will be overexposed, leading to the so-called clipping, as in loss of detail, which reflects in the histogram whenever the curve or values go beyond and above 255 mark in the very top, similar to raising the blacks, going beyond or below the bottom limit of 0. And then underexposing some parts of the footage. We're so-called clipping the blacks and losing information in the footage. In general, we're preferring the highlights and shadows to be in the very edges of the histogram. We're just creating a little bit more flavor, or making it come to life a little bit more normally. But we don't want to go too far outside the range, because then we might lose a little bit of details in the footage as we are creating clippings, as in we are crushing the shadows or blowing out the highlights. We might swap over to the HDR, and it's giving us this view used for high dynamic range content view with a little bit more room for the highlights. And float, as instead of the 8-bit going between 0 to 255, instead going between 0 and 1. But this is because we have the clamp signal marked, and thus cutting off the view of any over or under exposure of the footage. So turning it off in the float, it now lets us see beyond the normal mark at 0 at the bottom and at 1 at the top. So let's quickly swap over the mountains green, the layer, and just overlook the difference, and now watching how that range of shadow and brightness will be spreading out here as well. So by heavily lowering the contrast, the colors will be washed out. While increasing it to the very max, instead it will be creating this clipping and an overwhelmed contrast intensity. A really great and also very common thing is to do this adjustment with the so-called curves, thus increasing the highlights in the top and shadows in the bottom. We got the midtones in the very middle here. This is also where this quite popular type of S-curve, if you might be familiar with, finds its place for a little bit more control of the contrast, thus brightening up the mid highlights and darkening the mid shadows, creating a little bit more contrast overall. For just a very fast understanding and reading of these values, the histogram might be enough to just do it in a more quick way. But to get those a little bit more accurate and precise control and visual readings, then the next two might be preferable. And especially as well working together with the Vectorscope as well, using all these three together. Jumping over to the Parade RGB, presenting us with the values of the red, green and blue channels separately. Now being in the float, showing the color values on the right ranging from 0 for the very darkest shadows and blacks at the bottom, and then we got 1.0 for the brightest highlights and whites at the very top, just as for the histogram. Having a look in the 8-bit, we recognize the same values, but now instead as 0 to 255. And going over to the HDR, it looks something like this. But let's keep to the well-fitting float for this one. The values on the left show the IRE, or the Institute of Radio Engineers units, ranging between the 0 with the pure blacks and no signal, and we can go up to 100 with the pure white and the brightest parts of the footage. Then we just get everything in here between as the midtones. In general, striving for a somewhat type of balance between the colors, especially when we are color correcting. But of course there's always a little bit of diversity and difference, but normally quite a good balance in there between. And then perhaps when we're doing the grading, we want to, maybe we go a little bit more on some of them to create a specific type of tone or a type of feeling within the footage. Like in this one, the blue mountain layers, for example, we're having a little bit more balance between the red and green, while the blue is quite increased in the highlights. With the mountains green instead, even here in this one, we can see that the red and green are fairly balanced between each other. Using the RGB curve again, but individually for red, green and blue. Perhaps adjusting the greens just a little bit here under the upper midtones. And the shadows could be lowered just a splash. While raising the midtones of the blue just a little bit. Perhaps some more fine-tuning using the color wheels. Even add another effect like the color balance to it. If preferring just adjusting a bit with the direct values instead. Although this might make the colors a little bit more balanced, but we're not really getting that same type of feeling and look anymore with the footage, as we completely change the tone of it. Keep this in mind as you are separating between the actual color correction and the color grading, as color grading gives you a little bit more flexibility to change between the actual tone and feeling within the footage, and it's just a little bit more combination of both the science and art kind of woven together in a nice package. We could also, as a bit of an alternative, be using the Parade scope for color matching, and what I would do is placing the two footage beside each other in the comp, scaling them down to roughly half size in the very horizontal. Premiere Pro got a direct type of comparison view to be able to use this, but if you don't want to move over there directly or use plugins, effects, etc. to create a type of color matching, this could be perhaps a type of alternative. Maybe not the best and first alternative, but at least it's an alternative. Then we'll be scaling it a bit larger than half size, since I found that the Lumetri Scopes just becomes a little bit brighter when they actually overlap somehow, making it a little bit easier for the actual reads, which by the way can also be adjusted slightly, normally under the settings. So go into brightness and choose between bright, normal or dimmed. And now we're able to see the RGB waveforms for both our footage in the Parade scope beside each other. And going back to the curves or just whatever tool preferred to be able to adjust each of the RGB channel separately. Duplicate and separate the adjustment layers. We do a pre-comp or add a Lumetri color just directly to the layer depending on your preferences. And just let us undo this and go back to our previous view of just the mountains green for now. We just saw and worked with the Parade scope using only the RGB now, but there are a few more types or modes we can use for viewing our visual data in the footage, both for this one and for the next one coming up, the so-called waveform. Let's jump into the settings again, down in Parade type, and I will choose the YUV as the luminance and chrominance. Y to the left represents the brightness, while U in the middle as the green and magneta, and the V to the very right as the yellow and blue. Normal RGB is the standard, but if you for whatever reason just want to see the YUV instead, then at least it's there. And if you don't want to see the specific colors on the actual waveform, either choose the RGB or the YUV white instead. Before the very last scope, let's just mention the color space, which letting us choose between the Rec 601, 709, and 2020. You might want to use the Rec 601 for encoding analog video signals in digital video form, while the 709 for the HD TV as normal workflows, and 2020 HDR and UHD TV for the 4 and 8K. The last scope we're checking out is the waveform. This waveform functions just like the Parade with the same measures on the left and the right sides. But instead of showing all three RGB colors separately, like in the Parade, the waveform RGB is overlapping them. Just as with the Parade, the range of the scope going from left to the right, and represents the same area in the footage and composition. For example, there's a little bit more blue color over here at the top, reflected from the blue sky. However, viewing the top and bottom values, whenever manipulating the exposure and brightness, aren't directly represented from the image, but instead you got those very brightest part at the top of that sideway range, and you'll got the very darkest part at the very bottom. The waveform can be just another way of giving a little bit more accurate viewing on the RGB balance on specific parts or specific areas on the footage, while also understanding the exposure and the brightness a bit better for the footage. We might also change the type to Luma or luminance, now giving us a bit lower and taller spectrum, ranging between the -20 on the left or -0.2. We got up to 120 and 1.2 respectively. Great for watching and adjusting only the brightness and the contrast. And then with the YC type, Y still stands for the actual luminance and C for the chrominance. Maybe a little bit confusing when we had the UV for the chrominance before, but literally it's just taking that UV and combining it together to one signal, and thus represented by the actual C in YC. Lastly, the YC, no chroma, just offer us only the view of the luminance, so literally just Y instead of the YC. Same as type Luma, but displayed in this green color and also this shorter range than the other one. Finally, the other presets we have under settings are just a few different ways of viewing all four scopes, but with different types that we just been through already, giving us just more than enough for any type of color correction, color grading, or color matching as well. And I would recommend to dig a little bit further into the color subject and get a little bit more knowledge around from different type of sources and fully understand it. And also experiment a little bit with the Lumetri Scopes and the Lumetri color effect to just get a good feeling about it. Check out all the settings plus the value of actually using this nice top function, input LUT, as well, showing off the option to import custom LUTs to be able to manipulate color and tone or use any type of default ones as just as a form of color grading. Hopefully this part we're able to shine a little bit of color on and brightening up those parts that can somewhat be a little bit deep and complex when we're going through the jungle of coloring.